Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're playing everyone's favorite game, Draft or Pass. Over the course of today's episode, I'm going to be answering the singular question as to whether we should be drafting or passing on these fantasy prospects going into our 2022 fantasy football leagues. Now, in order to make this a little bit more interesting and give you guys a little bit more insight in the decision-making processes that I have in my drafts, I'm going to go ahead and add a condition to every single player's circumstance, because in my opinion, I'm willing to draft every single player at the right ADP and value going into the 2022 season. So in order to go ahead and pinpoint exactly where I feel comfortable with these given players, I've added a condition. Now, before we begin, I want to remind you guys, if you have not yet already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We're making fantasy football content on the daily for the entirety of the 2022 season with the singular goal of helping you win a 2022 fantasy football championship. Also, if you want to go ahead and get my fantasy football draft rankings this weekend, the best way to do so is via Underdog Fantasy. Again, if you go ahead and sign up today using promo code Andrew via Underdog Fantasy, there's a link down in the description. Not only will you get my half and full PPR draft rankings within 24 hours. Again, if you want them by tomorrow, you got to sign up today, and I'll go ahead and send that in your direction from my personal email to yours. The earliest it will be sent out by tomorrow would be 2 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, and you'll have to check your junk and spam folder because it might end up in there. But either way, if you're interested, you can sign up today with a minimum deposit of $10 using promo code Andrew, link in the description. And not only are you going to get the opportunity to sign up, get those rankings, but you'll also be able to draft some teams, get some experience before your drafts tomorrow, and also on top of that, you're getting a first deposit match up to $100. So if you want to go ahead, deposit a little bit more, get yourself more drafts under your belt, or maybe even get into the pick'ems game, you can definitely do so. Go ahead and check that out. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into the draft or pass conversation with the 10 prospects we're going to be talking about today, beginning with our first player, Cordarrelle Patterson, running back of the Atlanta Falcons. Now, again, I went ahead and I collected the players' names via the comment section. I went ahead and found every single player that has been mentioned in my comment section asking me, Andrew, what do you think about this player going into the 2022 season? Majority of these players that I haven't mentioned in given videos at an extended rate. So I wanted to go ahead and give some, light to them and give you guys my perspective. So let's begin with Cordarrelle Patterson. As of right now, his current condition is RB3 in a PPR format. Listen, if you go ahead and look at what Cordarrelle Patterson was able to accomplish last season on an extremely bad Atlanta Falcons team, I understand that they may be even worse this year considering they're going from Matt Ryan to Marcus Mariota, but ultimately, the opportunity is going to look very similar for Cordarrelle Patterson. Though he was splitting touches with Mike Davis last year, they brought in Damian Williams. They also brought in Tyler Algier, the rookie out of BYU. They're going to have similar competition. He's going to get some rushing attempts taken away from him. Again, this is a wide receiver turned running back, so his body isn't in the position to where they're going to hand him the ball 300 times. We're certainly not expecting that as an outcome, so his receiving work is definitely going to have to be the biggest difference maker in terms of his overall fantasy point contribution. Now, if you go ahead and look at what he was able to accomplish last season, weeks 1 through 9, he was averaging 16.84 half PPR fantasy points per game. Now, in a full PPR, obviously those numbers continue to stretch in the correct direction, giving us more points per week. But you got to remember, last year, he scored 11 touchdowns out of the total 33 Atlanta Falcons offensive touchdowns. Now, if you go ahead and scale that number back, obviously we're going to see a lot less production, but even if you go ahead and just look at his entire body of work from last season, even in the second half of the year after the knee injury and after he had, consecutive games of tough matchups. I know from weeks 11 through 18, he disappointed many of us, only averaging 9.93 fantasy points per game. But you got to remember, four of those 7 games consisted of New Orleans, Tampa Bay, San Francisco, Buffalo. 4 really strong run-stopping defenses, and yet he was still able to be a 10-point per game fantasy point contributor. Not only that, I went ahead and specifically took away the 11 touchdowns that he scored last season. And I just wanted to kind of give you guys some perspective as to where he would have ended up last year. Last season, in a half PPR scoring format, he was the number 9 overall running back. If you go ahead and take away 66 of his fantasy points off the total last year, and he scores no touchdowns going into 2022, he would still finish as the number 29 running back. That means as an RB3 in any category, especially even in a full PPR scoring format, he has inherent value because the amount of work he is getting as a receiver, whether it is as checkdowns out of the backfield or even lining up out wide, the touchdowns are going to be scored. As to how many, we're going to have to wait and see. But even if he scores a low amount, the amount of work he gets in terms of overall opportunity is going to lead to a success. Therefore, Cordarrelle Patterson, in my mind, is a draft player going into 2022. Moving on, let's talk about Antonio Gibson. Again, there's been a lot of conversation regarding his value going into the 2022 season because we all anticipated a running back by committee situation. And up until just last week, it was pretty much on track to be that, hence week 1. The Washington Commanders were exactly going to execute that strategy with Brian Robinson and J.D. McKissic as the rotating 3. So obviously with the off-the-field injury that Brian Robinson sustained, he is going to now be on the injured reserve. He's not going to be able to play until week 5 potentially. And even once he comes back, there is an opportunity for Brian Robinson to pick up exactly where he left off as the lead back, especially on early downs for this offense. You got to remember, Antonio Gibson, even though for the last 2 consecutive years, he has been a top 12 running back in fantasy football, he was a wide receiver converted to running back. That's the number one thing that Cordarrelle Patterson and Antonio Gibson both have in common, and which we've continued to see, even with guys like Deebo Samuel last year. This is a continuing trend, but as of right now, it looks like because of the fumbling issues and the way that he has played recently, the organization is kind of pivoting away from him and going in the direction of Brian Robinson. And if, in fact, Brian Robinson returns in week 5 with J.D. McKissic still in this backfield taking majority of the receiving work, the value of Antonio Gibson, I mean, again, look at his ADP via Underdog right now. He's still the 93rd overall player off the board on average. And as the current condition of having him as my RB3, a guy that would either have to be in the rotational mix if injuries take place, bye weeks show up, or is going to be my flex player on a given week, I don't think I can trust Antonio Gibson after the first month of the season. I know he's a tough player. He certainly played through a bunch of injuries last year, and when given the opportunity to be the lead back of this team at the back end of the year, the guy was averaging 15 fantasy points per game. I know he's got the talent. I know he has the ability and the opportunity is there, but I don't think they're going to give him said opportunity any longer to be the lead back of this team. With that being said, as of right now, with the condition of him having to be an RB3 on my roster, I'm just not interested in Antonio Gibson. We'll go ahead and move on to our next player. Let's talk about James Cook. James Cook, rookie running back out of Georgia. He's going to be playing behind Devin Singletary. Of course, Zach Moss may be still involved in this offense, but let's talk about what James Cook currently presents to us. Obviously, he's coming out of college. His final year in 2021 with the Georgia Bulldogs. 113 total rushing attempts for 728 rushing yards, 7 rushing touchdowns, 30 targets that led to 27 receptions, 284 receiving yards, and 4 receiving touchdowns. As a whole, I went ahead and looked at the entire body of work from James Cook at Georgia. He only had 302 total touches in his career there. That includes offensively, that includes special teams. He really didn't see that many touches because there were other running backs in that backfield. But currently, he's being considered the number 2 back in this offense and primarily the receiving back for the Buffalo Bills. So I wanted to go ahead and give you guys an idea as to what exactly that means. Last season, the Buffalo Bills targeted their running backs 91 times. That led to 70 receptions, 497 total receiving yards, 4 receiving touchdowns, 108.7 half PPR fantasy points. So as a whole, there is still opportunity in this backfield to be a receiving threat and certainly benefit from that, even though Josh Allen is a mobile quarterback and will scramble for yards, and there are designed runs in his direction in order to continue to get yards as an offense. But in terms of what James Cook is walking into, there's a lot of opportunity. We're talking about Devin Singletary that maybe in his final years with the Buffalo Bills, and James Cook could very easily supplant him as the starter midway through the season. Now, at the beginning, they're going to lean towards the player that has more experience, that they trust more at this time. But it's only a matter of time until James Cook could very easily take this spot. And at his current condition of being an RB4 on my roster in a PPR scoring format, again, considering he is going to be the receiving threat of this backfield, let's not forget, this offseason, the Buffalo Bills wanted to sign J.D. McKissic. J.D. McKissic pretty much had the paper signed, then backed out very last second, went back to the Washington Commanders and re-signed there. In order to fill the spot that they lost J.D. McKissic, and they brought in Duke Johnson, and they drafted James Cook. Duke Johnson has since been cut after training camp. He did not make the 53-man roster, and James Cook looks like he's going to be the primary receiving threat of this offense and could very easily get himself in the rotation of early down work and maybe, just maybe, become the starter of a top-tier offense, which only means more fantasy points. At this current position, at his current ADP, the value looks like an absolute must-draft position. That's exactly what we're doing in 2022. Moving on, let's talk about Terry McLaurin, another player from the Washington Commanders. All right, so here's the thing about Terry McLaurin. In the last 3 years, he has had a absolute ridiculous rotation at the quarterback position. I think Carson Wentz is going to be his 9th quarterback of his career in 2022, which again, he hasn't been in the league for very long. And the fact that that is the case, it truly does speak to how terrible the Washington organization has been for the last couple years. That being said, Terry McLaurin with a complete carousel at the quarterback position, has been the number 27, number 21, and number 25 overall wide receiver in fantasy football for the last 3 years. Now, last season, obviously, I've mentioned this in the past, whether it was via our tier list video or any other time I've talked about Terry McLaurin, he only had 62.6% of his targets deemed catchable, which was the lowest amongst all receivers last season with 100 or more targets. Obviously, Taylor Heinicke didn't do very well, but then again, Taylor Heinicke wasn't that bad of a quarterback in terms of stats. Still got himself over 20 passing touchdowns. When you're in that conversation and you're bringing in Carson Wentz, of course, we expect Carson Wentz to help elevate Terry McLaurin. But how much do we trust Wentz in that regard? If I'm going to go ahead and use the current ADP as an identifier as to when I have to go ahead and select Terry McLaurin going into this season, if he is going to be in that 4th round and I have to grab him as potentially my wide receiver 2 on roster, it is an extremely dangerous position when I look at him in comparison to the other wide receivers available at that point. There are other wide receivers in far more productive offenses that are going to have just as many targets as him that I trust more going into the 2022 season. If you go ahead and specifically look at the amount of times Terry McLaurin had, top 12 fantasy weeks in comparison to weeks where he didn't even get into the top 36 wide receivers, there are far more negative performances from 2021. And truth be told, I think there was only 3 performances last year which really carried his overall season. There were 3 performances that consisted of 40% of his total fantasy point contribution, which is extremely worrisome. Yes, you can go ahead and get him more targets, but it doesn't mean that Carson Wentz is going to be the reason that Terry McLaurin steps up to that next level. Therefore, I'm going ahead and passing on him as my wide receiver 2 at his current ADP. Moving on, let's talk about Brandon Aiyuk, another wide receiver. All right, so Brandon Aiyuk currently coming off the board at an ADP of 68.5. Again, going into last season, Brandon Aiyuk was selected far before that, considering how much hype he had. Again, at the end of the 2020 year, from week 7 through 16, he had an incredible stint of games in which he was averaging over 15 fantasy points per game and was the number 6 wide receiver in fantasy points per game throughout that span of time. Obviously, with that momentum, many of us thought that the hype would continue into 2021, but little did we know Deebo Samuel was going to be the primary receiver that took over in that offense. Now, that being said, it wasn't a matter of Brandon Aiyuk not playing well early in the 2021 year. It was a matter of them not giving him any opportunity to play, and Kyle Shanahan really just not being interested in utilizing Brandon Aiyuk and his ability. Last season, from weeks 1 through 8, Brandon Aiyuk was the number 91 overall wide receiver, only averaging 4.24 fantasy points per game throughout the first 7 games. Then, all of a sudden, something changed. Kyle Shanahan finally, came to his senses and realized, we have to utilize Brandon Aiyuk if we want to continuously, threaten defenses. If we're going to use Deebo Samuel in the backfield, we have to have another wide receiver out there stretching defenses and making plays, especially outside the numbers. And that's exactly what he did. Last season, from weeks 9 through 18, a completely shift. In the last 10 games of the year, he was averaging 11.26 fantasy points per game and was the number 13 overall wide receiver and number 18 in terms of fantasy points per game with a 5-game minimum. Overall, we saw a complete transition towards giving Brandon Aiyuk more opportunities. And all we've heard this offseason from Kyle Shanahan and Trey Lance is that they're going to continue to do the same in 2022. And all we've seen from training camp is Trey Lance continuously sending the ball in Brandon Ayuk's direction and finding a lot of success. Therefore, as a wide receiver 3 condition going into the 2022 season, I'm back in on the Brandon Aiyuk train. I know he burnt many of us last year. I'm ready to get hurt again. Here we go. All right, moving on. Let's talk about his quarterback, Trey Lance. Now, the condition for his current circumstances, he has to be drafted in a 6-point per passing touchdown league as your quarterback 1. Now, as of this current moment in time, his current ADP in a regular league would be, 73rd off the board. Now, with that being the case, that is extremely concerning for me. A quarterback who I don't expect to throw that many touchdowns, and I believe is going to have the ability to run for 700 yards and 7 touchdowns this year, if not more at both categories, I'm expecting a lot of his points to come from the running game. And if in fact we do see his, passing game take a little bit of a hit because of that, that shouldn't be a surprise. But in comparison, from a 6-point to 4-point per passing touchdown league, there's a big difference, especially considering when we're talking about those pocket passing quarterbacks like a Kirk Cousins. Last year, you got to remember, Kirk Cousins had an identical fantasy point per game contribution than Jalen Hurts last season. They both averaged about 22.9 fantasy points per game. So when I look at the value of a Trey Lance, And I know he has a lot of potential going into the 2022 year, but I look at how much value you have to utilize in order to get him on your roster. If you're playing in a 6-point per passing touchdown format, again, unless your quarterback is a Josh Allen or a Patrick Mahomes who have the ability to run the ball and get extra value that way, but have to also be premier passing threats, I'm very much so leaning in the direction of passing on one of these mobile quarterbacks who cannot send the ball down the field and get themselves a consistent amount of passing touchdowns. This also would include players like Justin Fields, who is similarly in the same boat. Overall, I'd rather just draft a pocket passer because I certainly think they'll be able to score more per week in 2022. All right, moving on. Let's talk about Kadarius Toney, another one of these names that I saw often in the comment section. The reason why I haven't mentioned Kadarius Toney all offseason is because, he has been injured a lot, whether it's been this offseason, whether it was last year. And though he has shown us glimpses of, being an incredible player, especially after the catch, I am concerned about his overall potential in 2022 if he's not able to stay healthy. But with that being said, the only other receivers that are purely contesting him for targets is Kenny Golladay, who by all accounts has looked awful this offseason, whether it was at practice or in those games. I mean, again, he was playing in the third preseason game. None of the other starters were in that context except for him. That pretty much means Kenny Golladay is trending towards being a second-team wide receiver with an $85 million contract. Just putting that in perspective. Wan'Dale Robinson, though I think he's going to play well and probably be that slot receiver if Sterling Shepard isn't healthy, again, he's still a rookie. And trusting in a rookie right off the bat is tough to do. So where does that leave us? That leaves us with Daniel Jones and his number one premier wide receiver option, Kadarius Toney. Coming off the board, 86th, 87th overall on average. As a wide receiver 3 on my team in an offense that really isn't great, I'm expecting this team to throw the ball a lot because I don't expect their defense to be able to stop anybody. The game script should predominantly be heavy passing, and even if Daniel Jones is going to turn over the ball, they're going to have to come back down the field and throw once again. And Kadarius Toney being a potential, closer to the line of scrimmage receiving option could fit into that slot role perhaps this season and be a great fantasy point contributor for us. So specifically as a wide receiver 3 at his current position, if healthy, I want him on my team going into 2022. Moving on. Let's talk about Julio Jones. All right, so here's the thing about Julio. Obviously, he's going to be filling in for AB. And that is going to be pretty difficult to say the least, considering how great Antonio Brown has looked in the last 2 years. Just to put it in perspective, in the last 13 regular season games that Antonio Brown played for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, assuming he didn't leave early with an injury or, leave the game by taking off his pads and running off the field against the Jets, he had 115 targets that led to 83 receptions, 985 yards, 8 receiving touchdowns, 188.4 fantasy points in 13 games again, playing 79% of the offensive snaps out wide. So if you go ahead and put Julio Jones into that conversation, Julio on one side, Mike Evans on the other, Chris Godwin in the slot position, my goodness, I really do believe that Julio Jones is being slept on, especially at his current ADP of 116. Man, if you're going to be associated with a Tom Brady offense of the past, maybe we could have said, oh, they're all washed, don't worry about it. But the way that Tom Brady has looked in the last 2 years, especially last season, setting career highs in passing attempts, passing completions, total passing yards, second highest passing completion percentage of his career, second most passing touchdowns of his career last season. I just think this is a recipe for success. If you're going to be associated with such a premier top tier offense, of course, success is going to be found across the board. And as long as defenses are paying close attention to Mike Evans, Leonard Fournette, Chris Godwin, Cameron Brate, Kyle Rudolph, Russell Gage, they have so many weapons on this team. If they ever leave Julio on an island, I expect him to cause a lot of havoc for defensive coordinators and a lot of defenses. At his current condition of being a wide receiver 4, I want him in all circumstances. Even if, in fact, we're going to get a situation where we get burnt by Julio because he gets injured and leaves, that's fine by me because I know that the value in which I am, investing in him isn't going to break my season. You got to remember, the teams that you draft are not going to be the teams that you have in 14 weeks. They're going to look far different. And if, in fact, they look identical, you've either gone AFK and not looked at your team for quite some time, or you've somehow drafted the best team of all time, which congratulations on doing that. All right, moving on. Let's talk about Marquez Valdes-Scantling, another wide receiver. All right, so here's the issue I have with Marquez Valdes-Scantling. In his career with the Green Bay Packers, especially how much success Aaron Rodgers found in the last 2 years, the fact that Marquez Valdes-Scantling couldn't be a relevant wide receiver already kind of tips his hand, in my opinion. The fact that Aaron Rodgers threw for 85 touchdowns in the last 2 seasons And Marquez Valdes-Scantling was only capable of catching 9 of them. I know he missed some time due to injury, but still, being the number 2 wide receiver for a Aaron Rodgers-led offense in the past has been extremely beneficial. I mean, you go back in the days where Jordy Nelson and Randall Cobb were both dominating for this team. Both those guys were getting over 85 catches a year. Now, if you wanted to go ahead and play a wide receiver on the opposite end of Devontae Adams, a guy that was pulling double coverage in many different circumstances, obviously you were going to find yourself a lot of opportunity, but Marquez Valdes-Scantling was just a deep receiving threat option, purely. Now, when I looked into it in the last 2 years, anytime he was given 5 or more targets, he averaged 11.2 fantasy points per game, and those are decent numbers, but he literally never once scored over 10 fantasy points without scoring a touchdown in a game. That's the kind of dependability that he requires. And when you're going ahead and inserting him into the Kansas City lineup and expecting that he could fill into the Kansas City Tyreek Hill role, I think a lot of us are far too hopeful for the skill that Marquez Valdes-Scantling has. I understand they paid him a lot of money. 3 years, $30 million is no joke. But if you're expecting him to immediately jump into this offense after being with the back-to-back MVP and find immediate success, I think you're mistaken. You got to go ahead and look at it from our perspective in this regard. Last year, Tyreek Hill as a deep receiving threat was pretty much nullified. He only had 2 receiving touchdowns of over 20 yards down the field. In comparison to seasons past where he was able to consecutively do that, 8 touchdowns per season, 20 or more yards down the field. In comparison to last year, we saw a lot of defenses running cover 2 and preventing Patrick Mahomes from throwing it over the top. And that's exactly what we talked about for majority of last season when Patrick Mahomes was finding his struggles. They got him into a position where they said, Patrick, we want you to dice us up 8 yards at a time. And we know you're going to get bored and you're going to make a mistake and you're going to turn over the ball because that's exactly the way you want to play it. You want to play the deep passing game. But obviously, Patrick Mahomes fell apart and Tyreek Hill wasn't utilized in that regard. In fact, Tyreek Hill played and had the most stats he's ever had from the slot position last season because they couldn't throw the ball deep. So if you think they're going to get into a position where defenses are no longer going to sit in cover 2 and force Patrick Mahomes to make those similar mistakes, again, like I'm saying, I'm not too interested in Marquez Valdes-Scantling, especially at the current condition and his ADP. Moving on, let's talk about another player, formerly of the Chiefs, now going to the Green Bay Packers this offseason. So let's talk about Sammy Watkins, okay? Currently at an ADP of 176. As the number 5 wide receiver on my team, I'm perfectly fine like this, but this is something that I wanted to paint for the entire Green Bay Packers receiving core. If we're in a position where late in your draft, you can take at least one of the Green Bay Packers wide receiver, whether it is Allen Lazard, Randall Cobb, Sammy Watkins, Romeo Doubs, or even Christian Watson. If you're able to get at least one of them, okay, as one of your final picks to your draft, I think there's some chance that you could get some return value on that. Because if in fact you do hit the lottery ticket in terms of who's going to be the primary wide receiver of this offense, and we've heard Aaron Rodgers a lot this offseason rave about multiple guys saying that he's confident in all of them. Okay, great. I'm glad you're confident in all of them, but we need to know who the number 1 is going to be. And as of right now, in terms of who is the most veteran receiver on that team outside of a Randall Cobb, it's Sammy Watkins. And in comparison to the rest of the gang, he's been the guy that as of late, has the most success. He's played with Patrick Mahomes in the past, played with Lamar Jackson last year, now goes to Aaron Rodgers, and hopefully Aaron Rodgers, his MVP status isn't fading away. I don't think it is. He should be able to elevate wide receivers like a Sammy Watkins. So as of right now, at an ADP of 167, it's another one of these players that I want to have on roster as a wide receiver 5 very easily. All right, moving on to our final option. Let's talk about DeAndre Swift. Okay, so many of you asked me in the comment section, Andrew, are you willing to ever run a hero RB strategy? Because we know you like to run a strategy in which you get 2 running backs within your first 3 selections in order to make sure that the drop-off in production doesn't end up forcing you to dip back into the running back position throughout the dead zone. Well, here's my current train of thought. If in fact you are going to invest in a DeAndre Swift as your hero RB, the first running back you take for the first 6 rounds, I'm perfectly fine with that overall execution. But what you have to ensure that you do, especially with running backs in those first couple rounds, is you got to make sure you get their handcuffs. I don't care if you want to have Dalvin Cook as your hero or Najee Harris or Joe Mixon or DeAndre Swift. As long as you're in a scenario where later in your draft in the double-digit rounds, whether it's rounds 10 through 12, you have to make sure you get their handcuffs. Whether it's Jamal Williams for DeAndre Swift, whether it's Rachaad White for Leonard Fournette, whether it's Alexander Mattison for Dalvin Cook, Mark Ingram for Alvin Kamara. If you're not able to get that handcuff, you're going to be in a little bit of a tricky situation because looking at DeAndre Swift in the last 2 years, the guy's missed 3 or 4 games each of the last 2 seasons. if you're going to get into a position where you're trusting that this singular running back can carry your given running back position, again, I think that's it's a little bit bold. But if you're going to do so, you got to make sure you have the handcuff, because all of the value in that given backfield is what you're investing in. You're not just investing in DeAndre Swift. You're investing in anybody who would ever touch the ball. So Jamal Williams has to be on roster. Either way, if you're able to go ahead and get a scenario where you're able to draft DeAndre Swift as a hero RB, you're able to get stud wide receivers, tight ends, quarterbacks early enough to where you can then dip back into the running back position in your 7th, 8th rounds and still find value. Cordarrelle Patterson, like I mentioned earlier. I like DeAndre Swift at that position. That's going to conclude today's video. I want to thank you all for watching. Tomorrow, we will be doing our annual predictions video, both predictions for the 2022 year. I'll be, giving out some Super Bowl predictions, predictions in terms of fantasy, which players can go above and beyond last year in our annual video. I predicted the incredible success of Cooper Kupp. Obviously, I didn't expect him to have that level of success, but either way, we'll talk about some of the predictions that I made last year and how off I was or on I was in some circumstances, and then I'll give you my predictions. So that'll be tomorrow. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Be sure to subscribe if you have not yet already. Check out Underdog Fantasy if you're looking for rankings. Again, if you sign up today using promo code Andrew and make a first-time deposit, not only will you get a first-time deposit match up to $100, not only will you be able to draft some teams, play some pick'ems, get some experience there, have some fun via fantasy football, but you'll also get my 2022 fantasy football draft rankings, half and full PPR. Again, if you sign up today, that'll be sent to you tomorrow, Sunday, at 2 p.m. PST. If that's something you're interested in, be sure to use the code. Thank you very much. All right, guys. Until next time tomorrow, I'll see you guys. Peace.